A shovel strikes hard earth. Somewhere, a night bird calls. The mourners left hours ago, but something waits in the shadows. Something hungry. What if I told you that long before modern horror films, people throughout the Middle East and North Africa lived in genuine terror of creatures that stalked cemeteries at night? Monsters that weren't just stories to frighten children, but beings so feared that specific burial practices evolved just to protect the dead from their insatiable hunger. Tonight, we're unearthing the blood-curdling history of one of humanity's oldest and most disturbing monsters, the ghoul. These aren't the mindless zombies you know from movies or the seductive vampires of modern fiction. Ghouls are something altogether more calculating, more ancient, and in many ways more terrifying. They hunt with intelligence, change their shape to lure victims, and feast on human flesh with horrifying deliberation. The most unsettling part? Unlike many monsters created for entertainment, ghouls emerged from genuine belief. For centuries, people lived in absolute terror that these creatures might be lurking just beyond the village boundaries, waiting for nightfall. Let's begin our journey in the moonlit deserts of pre-Islamic Arabia, where the ghoul was born. The wind howls across empty dunes. A lone traveller hears someone calling for help. The term ghoul comes from the Arabic ghoul, derived from gala, meaning to seize. A chilling reference to how these creatures were thought to capture and devour their victims. Ancient Arabic poetry mentions ghouls as early as the 5th century, describing them as desert demons that could shift their forms to lure unwary travellers to their doom. But here's where it gets truly disturbing. Unlike most monsters that attack indiscriminately, traditional Arabian ghouls possessed a specific, revolting appetite. They hungered for the flesh of the recently deceased, digging up graves to feast on corpses. This taboo violation, the desecration of human remains, made them objects of unique horror in cultures where proper burial was sacred. The earliest detailed accounts of ghouls appear in 1001 Nights, also known as Arabian Nights, a collection of Middle Eastern folk tales compiled during the Islamic Golden Age. These ancient stories depict ghouls as shape-shifting, desert-dwelling jinn supernatural beings in Islamic theology that exist in a parallel dimension to humans. Picture yourself crossing the vast Arabian desert at night in the 9th century. No electric lights, no GPS, just you, your camel, and the infinite darkness. Then you hear a voice calling, perhaps a fellow traveller in distress. But as you approach, the human form shifts and contorts in the moonlight, revealing its true nature too late. Traditional Arabian folklore described ghouls with nightmarish precision. Their true form was horrifying, rotting flesh hanging from humanoid frames, elongated limbs ending in razor-sharp claws, and glowing yellow eyes that pierced the darkness. But what made ghouls truly terrifying wasn't just their appearance, it was their cunning. Unlike mindless monsters, ghouls were calculating predators with near-human intelligence. They could mimic human voices with uncanny accuracy, calling out like a lost traveller to lure rescuers, or crying like an abandoned child to attract maternal instincts. Their hunting patterns were equally disturbing. While their primary food source was corpses freshly dug from graves, they weren't above attacking living humans when the opportunity arose. One of the most chilling early stories featuring ghouls comes from the tale of Sidi Numan in Arabian Nights. Listen to this disturbing account. A man named Sidi Numan becomes suspicious of his beautiful wife Amina, who barely eats at home but disappears at night. One evening he secretly follows her to a graveyard, where to his absolute horror he watches as she meets with a female ghoul. Together, they dig up a freshly buried corpse and feast on the dead flesh. His once beautiful wife is revealed as a monster wearing human skin. This story established several elements that would become standard in ghoul mythology: their ability to appear human, their nocturnal nature, and their compulsion to feast on the dead. As Islam expanded across North Africa, southern Europe, and parts of Asia, the concept of the ghoul spread with it. Different cultures incorporated ghouls into their own monster pantheons, often adapting the creature to reflect local fears and taboos. In Persian mythology, ghouls became associated with the desert demon Ghul-i-Biaban, a creature that could change shape and lured travelers to their deaths. In North African traditions, ghouls were sometimes portrayed as born from the union of demons and witches, creating a hereditary lineage of these monsters living alongside human communities. Picture this. In 15th century Ottoman territories, travellers would sometimes refuse to journey after sunset, specifically because of ghoul legends. Some caravans employed special guides known as ghoul seers, who claimed they could detect these creatures hiding in human form. As ghoul mythology spread westward into Europe, the creature began to evolve. European cultures, already familiar with various undead monsters, interpreted ghouls through their own folkloric lens. By the medieval period, European ghouls had become more explicitly associated with graveyards rather than deserts, and were sometimes confused or combined with other undead creatures, like revenants. A significant transformation occurred when Western literature began incorporating ghouls in the 18th and 19th centuries. The most influential literary treatment came from the American author H.P. Lovecraft in the early 20th century. In stories like Pickman's Model and The Dream Quest of Unknown Cardath, Lovecraft reimagined ghouls as a distinct species of cannibalistic, corpse-eating humanoids dwelling in vast underground catacombs beneath Boston and other cities. In Pickman's Model, one of Lovecraft's most disturbing stories, an artist creates unnervingly realistic paintings of ghouls feasting in graveyards and attacking humans. The narrator eventually discovers the terrifying truth. The artist wasn't using his imagination. He was painting from life, having discovered a colony of ghouls living in tunnels beneath the city. The artist's final fate is left ambiguous, but the implication is clear. He either fell victim to the ghouls or, more disturbingly, was becoming one himself. This concept, that ghouls might exist undetected beneath our very feet, emerging at night to feed in our cemeteries, injected new terror into the ghoul myth for modern audiences. It suggested these ancient monsters hadn't vanished with modernity, but had simply adapted, finding new hunting grounds in urban environments. Lovecraft's interpretation profoundly influenced subsequent portrayals in Western media, creating a distinct split between the traditional Arabian ghoul and the Western literary ghoul. This divergence would only grow more pronounced in the 20th and 21st centuries. The modern conception of ghouls has continued to evolve through film, television, literature, and games. Today, several distinct types of ghouls exist in popular culture. The traditional Arabian ghoul shapeshifting desert demons that lead travelers astray and feast on corpses still featured in Middle Eastern horror stories and some historically accurate Western media. The Lovecraftian ghoul subterranean humanoids with canine features who consume corpses and occasionally kidnap the living, common in horror literature and tabletop role-playing games. The zombie-like ghoul undead humans who consume flesh and brains, essentially functioning as more intelligent zombies. This version appears in franchises like Fallout and some horror films. The vampiric ghoul humans who serve vampires and gain some undead characteristics, popularized by role-playing games like Vampire the Masquerade and various vampire films. The radioactive ghoul, a unique interpretation from the Fallout video game series, depicting ghouls as humans mutated by radiation into immortal, decomposing beings. These various interpretations share the core connection to death and consumption of human flesh, but differ dramatically in their origins, abilities, and appearance, demonstrating how monster myths evolve as they cross cultural boundaries. What makes the ghoul particularly fascinating is what these creatures symbolize across different cultures and time periods. In their original Arabian context, ghouls represented several primal fears. They embodied the terror of the desert, a harsh environment where travelers could easily become lost and perish. The ghoul personified the desert's dangers in a form that could be warned against in folk tales. They represented anxieties about proper burial and body desecration. In Islamic tradition, proper burial with specific rituals is critically important. Ghouls threatened this sacred practice by defiling graves and consuming the dead. They symbolized the danger of deception. A ghoul's ability to mimic human appearance and voices warned against trusting strangers too easily, especially in isolated areas. As ghoul myths traveled to new cultures, they absorbed new symbolic meanings. In Victorian literature, ghouls often represented fears about mortality and the violation of the sanctity of death during a period when grave robbing for medical research was a genuine concern. In modern media, ghouls frequently symbolize our fears about human degradation and the thin line between humanity and bestiality. Particularly in post-apocalyptic settings, ghoul-like creatures often represent our anxiety about what humans might become when civilization collapses. The relationship between ghoul legends and actual historical practices creates a fascinating dimension to these monsters. Some scholars suggest that early ghoul stories might have been influenced by real incidents of grave robbery which occurred throughout the ancient world. Others point to the harsh realities of desert travel in pre-modern Arabia, where desperate survival situations occasionally led to cannibalism. Tales of ghouls might have provided a mythological framework for understanding such taboo behaviors when they occurred. There's also compelling evidence that some ghoul folklore served as cautionary tales against disturbing burial sites. In regions where ancient tombs contained valuable goods, stories of monstrous guardians would discourage grave robbing. In contemporary Middle Eastern countries, traditional ghoul folklore remains alive in rural areas and children's cautionary tales. Modern Arabic horror literature and film have begun reclaiming and reinterpreting the ghoul, often returning to its jinn origins while updating the context for contemporary audiences. So the next time you pass a cemetery at night and feel that instinctive shiver of dread, remember that you're experiencing one of humanity's oldest fears. The terror that something might view our mortal remains not as sacred vessels to be respected, but as a feast to be devoured. Perhaps somewhere in the darkness beyond the gravestones, yellow eyes are watching, clawed hands are digging, and inhuman jaws are opening wide, ready to consume not just flesh and bone, but the very dignity we afford to death itself. The ghoul stands as one of our most ancient and persistent monsters, a creature that reminds us that even in death, our bodies remain vulnerable to violation. And in that violation lies a horror more profound than death itself. The transformation of the sacred human form into nothing more than meat for a monster's meal. Sleep well tonight, and perhaps check that your windows are locked.